The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague.
Welcome to the Books Podcast. I'm Tim Hague. We have been having a high old time on Books Podcast recently. You may have heard us talking to Helen Lewis, Ben Okri and Philip Norman. We see no reason for the fun to stop, so we have a hugely entertaining and intriguing subject for this episode. Now, Charles Mackay, in his 1841 Memoirs of Extraordinary Delusion, wrote, "Men think in herds, go mad in herds, but only recover their senses slowly and one at a time." I love that quotation. Full disclosure, I robbed it from Dr. Madeleine Pelling's new book, Hoax, Truth and Lies in the Age of Enlightenment.
If they can do that, do the rules apply to the rest of us? There is something monstrous about Mary. You really wouldn't want to encounter her in the flesh. The anatomist, William Hay, cuts out her heart and he holds it up for the audience and someone shouts, "Not black then." If you've just given birth, if you have mastitis, if you're a bit depressed, if you have a cough, he will come to your house and electrocute you.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Maddie, welcome to Books Podcast.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Right, the theme of the book, which is the fascination of the hoaxer. Why are we fascinated by hoaxes and hoaxers?
I think that the hoax and the hoaxer are universally fascinating in any century. I think there's something about an individual, or seemingly an individual, and we might get to just who is telling the lies in this book in a little while. But, the idea of one person who steps out of the boundaries of normal behaviour, normal society, and does something a little bit odd that snowballs is endlessly interesting to us. And the route which we then take to unpick that and find the truth at the centre of a strange story is, it's universally appealing. And certainly it drew me to this topic and hopefully readers as well.
One is taken with them. A part of you rather admire, no, a big part of you admires the chutzpah and the invention, refusing to be constrained by the circumstances in which you're born. The hoaxer just isn't buying any of that.
Yeah, I think that's so true of certainly the hoaxes in this book, and we're looking specifically at the 18th century, but I think more generally people who, are drawn to this kind of behaviour, who become embroiled in these kinds of hoaxes are, people who step out of, as I say, their normal circumstances. They are not constrained by the expectations that have been placed on them by, for example, in the 18th century, their social class, their religious status, their gender. All of these things, they seem to sort of shake off and they're momentarily liberated. And it can cause chaos. It can cause society to turn and look and think, well, hold on, if they can do that, do the rules apply to the rest of us? And it's a really frightening, entertaining, fascinating thing. And people were drawn to it then, and I think they still are today.
You're a cultural historian, and I think your period is the Age of Enlightenment. But it seemed to me you had a particular reason to go there, and I'm going to suspect that it might be something to do with most of the cases, and we're going to talk in detail about some of the your case histories. They involve women breaking out of their constraints, and is that the point? Is that why we're in the Age of Enlightenment for this particular book? Because there've been tricks and deceits everywhere. Wooden Horse of Troy and the Piltdown Man and Ossian. There've been lots of. Yeah. But this particular period, you found really wonderful stories. But it's the women involved that are the interesting thing. Yes,
in the three stories that I cover, it is women at the centre of them. That is very true. And, as I hinted at, we will talk about who the liars are, and they're not always the women. But it's both a coincidence and not, I think, that is the case. I certainly didn't set out to write a book about three women. I was interested in, as you say, I'm an 18th century historian by training, and so this is a time period that I feel very comfortable and I've spent a lot of time in. And I already knew about a couple of hoaxes. This is kind of known as the golden age of the hoax, and I'll maybe come to why that is in a little moment. But I knew, for example, the very famous case of Mary Toft, a woman supposedly who gave birth to rabbits. Yes. Rabbits, parts of rabbits were indeed coming out of her person at one stage. Of course, this is not biologically possible. There was an explanation. And that's a really sort of infamous case that turned all kinds of class warfare on its head, the hierarchies of the time. So I knew about that. But it seems that even though there are men and women committing hoaxes in the 18th century, this period of so-called Enlightenment, it's the women who are remembered, the women who are blamed in this moment. And part of the reason for that, I think, is, you've alluded to it already, this idea that the 18th century is the age of enlightenment, this moment of scientific rationality, where the world, certainly Britain and Europe more generally, imagines itself as stepping out of the superstitious past, right? This idea that the ways that the world is supposedly governed, the mystery of God, magic, all of these dangers, these ideas that are largely invisible and exist in people's minds and can affect day-to-day life, how they love, how they live, the crimes they do or don't commit, all of that. That is supposedly rejected in the Age of Enlightenment. Science has arrived. The world has now been
Science
discovered.
has arrived, but that's part of the reason. You mentioned Mary Toft, who was giving birth to rabbits.
Yeah.
So we know that that's not a possibility, but the people at the time were seeing wonders of scientific varieties all
Yes.
the time.
Absolutely.
And so wonders were the new things, and new things happening was exactly what they might have expected.
And this is the fantastic thing about the 18th century. It's why it's such a complicated and interesting time. It's because it's not clean cut, it's not black and white. And I think my book is all about this grey area in between, right? So we have this idea that Enlightenment is literally bringing light to the dark, right? That it's illuminating things. And therefore, the mysteries of the world have been dispelled and we understand everything. We put it all into a category. But that is not the case. And we have to understand that science is in its infancy in this moment and that the world has not been fully catalogued, understood, discovered. There are encounters, and I use that word with heavy quotation marks, between Europeans and various indigenous groups, for example. There is new archaeology going on. Antiquarians are digging into the earth, not for the first time, but with real vigor in this moment. So we're going, we're looking at things like space, lightning, comets. The whole world is opening up, but nothing has fully been explained yet. And so there is this framework that's been put in place of reason and rationality and that everything has an explanation. And yet within that, the 18th century is a great period for spectacle, for entertainment. And people love to be shocked. People love to see something that is supposedly new. One of the hoaxes towards the end of the century, which I only mentioned briefly in a sentence or two, is I think it's maybe in the beginning of the 19th century, but my 18th century extends quite far, either side in each century. There's a mermaid that arrives in London, and it's exhibited, and people are like, well, of course this is a real mermaid because we haven't mapped all the seas yet. We're exploring. Someone's brought this back. It must be real. And it's parts of a fish and parts of, I think, a monkey or something that have been stitched together. But people didn't know any better, and so you have the sort of the guise of the mask of science and rationality, but behind the scenes there's all kinds of chaos going on. And there are people who inadvertently present falsities, but there are also people who lie to get ahead and to get their advantage. And so, it's sort of the Wild West of reason and chaos all happening at the same time. What's not to love? It's a wild time.
There's a hunger for novelty as well.
There is.
So
yes.
you adumbrate quite a lot of hoaxes and frauds and things. Although you tell in detail 3 case studies, which we're about to turn to. But the bottle conjurer is a great, and this isn't one of your 3, but you tell us about that because it tells us something about the expectation.
Yes, I love this story so much. So I open the book with the bottle conjurer in the introduction, and the term hoax in the 18th century is linguistically very close to that of hocus pocus.
I didn't know that until,
yes, which, we think of it as a sort of magical term. And I suppose, it is that. And hocus pocus was used to refer to the street magician, to sort of cheap trick conjurers. And there was, I suppose, a kind of contract that would exist between people who would go to annual fairs in London, or sometimes to see on the stage people doing this kind of magic, sleight of hand. You've got a bag full of coins, you rummage your hand into it and you pull out a live bird and it flies off over the audience, that kind of thing. And the contract is that the people watching know this isn't real. They understand that they're being tricked. They enjoy the spectacle.
It's the sort of Penn and Teller thing.
Exactly, yeah. And they think, that was lovely. They go home that night. They don't lie awake in their bed thinking, God, how did he do that? Was that real? Did I just see some magic? They understand it. the person performing the magic knows the audience is suspending their disbelief for the duration of that performance. However, the bottle conjurer then turns that on its head, and I think it really speaks to this 18th century, the sort of the hunger for novelty and the dangers in thinking that we've sussed the world and we've worked it all out. So the bottle conjurer in the 1740s he's an anonymous person. I say he, it's most likely a man, but we don't have necessarily proof for that. But someone starts to put pamphlets and posters up around London advertising this act. And this is a man who is going to come on stage. He's going to fit himself into a standard wine bottle. And, we're not talking any different from our own wine bottle sizes today. The 18th century wine bottle wasn't strangely large. And he's going to get inside, he's going to sing from inside the bottle, and he's going to tell people's fortunes. And there's a whole host of other things he's going to offer to do. And the whole of London is intrigued by this. Everyone's saying, have you seen that advert for the bottle? Should we go to that next week? Hundreds of tickets are sold. And crowds descend on the Drury Lane Theatre where this is set to take place. And people pour into their seats, and on the stage is a bottle, and it's on a table, and there's no one there. And the anticipation grows and grows. And then no one turns up. Nothing happens. And people are so frustrated by this that someone starts to rip out the seats in the theatre. Someone throws a lit candle down on the stage and it all goes up in flames. And soldiers are called to kind of control the crowd. And the theatre is nearly completely destroyed. And what has happened in this moment is that contract between the performer and the audience has been broken. The performer has shown that the lies you can tell on stage can be told in real life, and they can cause real life implications. They can control people's behavior and provoke a certain response. The performer has slipped anonymously into the crowd. He could be anyone among them. And this is sort of the beginning of this great age of the hoax.
Now, essentially, though, that is a fraud rather than a hoax in a sense. I mean, it is a hoax, but it's a fraud.
I would say in the 18th century that the definition between the two is somewhat loose. And I think, how would you define the two? What would you say the difference is? Because I suppose with a hoax, there's a longevity to it, maybe, that isn't necessarily there with the bottle conjurer. Although I will say the legacy of it lasts a long time, and it is listed in, you quoted at the beginning a 19th century writer speaking about hoaxes over the last few decades, and the bottle conjurer is always listed amongst those other hoaxes. So I think he's a hoaxer in the 18th century sense. Let's go with that, when their definitions are a little bit looser.
We have to turn to your three case studies, which are wonderful. Now, you treat them very novelistically, and we're going to do a little bit of violence to your structure because, of course, what you do is you present the story as it appeared, and then you go back and give us the background and explain. And there's no way we can avoid it. But the book's called Hoax, so
spoiler alert.
Yeah, very much spoiler alert. We're going to talk then about the ghost of Cock Lane, the Yorkshire Witch, and probably the most celebrated one is Princess Caraboo, which is the only one I'd heard of before. I think they made a movie of it a few years ago.
A very bad movie.
Was it a bad
in the 90s.
movie?
I mean, look, as a piece of art, sure, it stands up, but please, someone needs to redo this. It's such a fascinating story. We'll get to it, but it has so many elements that didn't make it into the movies.
You start with the Cock Lane, which is actually where we're recording right now.
We're sat a few metres away from Cock Lane.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It happened here, right here. But for listeners who are not with us, where is that? Where are we right now?
So we're in Smithfield. In fact, we can see the top of Smithfield Market, I think, if we look out the window. And Smithfield in the 18th century is really on the edge of the city. It's a really grimy place. It has these medieval origins, and it's got these sort of, winding passageways. It's not the great, grand Palladian mansions of the 18th century that you might see on, in Mayfair, for example, in this time. It's grimy, it's dangerous. The Smithfield Market itself is a meat market. There is blood running in the streets. Every year there's a fair in which animals are driven into the city. And of course you get the street conjurers, you get magic, magicians, all of that, fortune telling, etc. So it's sort of an interesting melting pot of different people. It's quite a fluid space, so people are renting rooms here rather than living permanently often. So you have a sort of transient community. Not everyone knows each other.
But of course lots of people did. If you read a biography of Dr. Dr. Johnson, who's
Yes.
an august person, and
Absolutely.
eventually ended up with a house over on Fleet Street. But he would rent rooms. That's a way to
Absolutely.
live.
Yeah, and this is absolutely the case in the 18th century, and so because of that, you get, and this is pertinent to our story in Cock Lane, you get these strange domestic arrangements where you have different families living together. You've got renters and landlords, and all kinds of tensions, transgressions. You get, for example, affairs between landladies and renters. You get
shocked.
murders.
Shocked and disappointed.
Yes, how could you possibly imagine such a thing?
So you've got these complicated relationships between people who have nothing in common except that they happen to be geographically and sometimes commercially associated. And in the case of Cock Lane, you've got we don't have time to do all the background, even though it's brilliantly done in the book. But there's a man called Kent who's brought his quasi-wife, and she's there's a scandal there, but we don't need to talk about that right now, although it's really interesting, to London, and he's renting a room. She is pregnant, and I'll run through this. She dies of smallpox. There's no question that she dies of smallpox.
There's absolutely none. We have the doctor's testimony. She died of smallpox.
And yet, the household then starts to find that she's haunting the place. So how does that happen? What are the
Yeah. So when Mr. and Mrs. in inverted commas Kent elope, because they do elope to London, because they're not married, they have to find rooms to rent and they have to reinvent their identities together. So they move into the house of the Parsons, and the Parson family, there's a father and a mother. Richard Parsons is the father, Elizabeth is the mother. There are two little girls. One is also called Elizabeth, but she's known as Betty, and she's 10 at the time when the Kents move in. Parsons is, he has a lay role at St Sepulchre's, which is a church just, metres from Cock Lane, where their house is. And they get on very happily together. Kent is away a lot for his business interests, and so he leaves his wife, in all but legality, who is called Fanny, behind in the house. And so she becomes very close with little Betty Parsons. And when Kent is away, the rooms at the top of the house in the attic that the Kents rent, Betty goes up there and sleeps in the same bed as Fanny, who is by now heavily pregnant, to keep her warm. And this was, it seems like a strange transgression to us now, but it would have been completely valid and ordinary then. And it's around that time when noises start to happen in the attic. There are knockings and scratching sounds that really frighten Fanny. She can't explain them. It only seems to happen when the child is in the room with her, but the child is asleep. She's not moving. She's not making these sounds. And it makes her very nervous, especially when Kent is away. There's this sort of strange tension going on. And for various reasons, the household falls apart. Kent lends Richard Parsons, his landlord, money. There's argument over who owes who what, who's going to pay back what and when. There's lots of heavy drinking going on. There's visitors to the house that Fanny isn't comfortable with. All of this is sort of nightmare rented situation. For any listeners who rent in London, I'm sure you've come across similar yourselves. And so Fanny starts to become ill. As you say, she has smallpox. She hasn't given birth yet. She's facing the impending birth, in this kind of deteriorating state. Kent moves them out of the house. They go to other lodgings, and very sadly, Fanny dies. And that should be the end of her story. It's very typical, tragically, of women in this period. He puts her in an unmarked coffin because whilst he's happy to lie to other people that they're married, he isn't prepared to do that in front of God. So she dies, by the way, before she gives birth, so the child is buried with her in the coffin, in this unmarked coffin, and it goes into the crypt at St John Clerkenwell, which again is not far from where we're recording this. I've just been there, in fact, and walked past. And she's laid to rest, and that should be the end of it. But the money is still owed between these two households. And Kent, who is, I go into his backstory, but he's a real piece of work. He's arrogant. He's always on the make. He's a social climber. He's always determined that he will come out on top. And he finds someone else to marry who is wealthy. He inherits some money from Fanny's family. It's all very complicated. There's a lot of kind of legal toing and froing and frustration and resentment from her family, etc., because of the elopement. And the Parsons family feel that they have been hard done by Kent. They feel like they are owed something. And so 2 years after Fanny dies, and I think this is remarkable, thinking about that transience in London, how quickly things changed, they really hold on to this grudge. And 2 years later, little Betty Parsons, who is now 12 years old, claims that when she goes into the attic and sleeps there, she hears knockings and scratchings again. Not only this, but she says the ghost will speak to her. It will knock once for yes and twice for no. And she asks it all manner of questions. Now, it is unclear whether it's little Betty who comes up with this narrative herself or whether it is the father, Richard Parsons. And I think this is key because getting to the truth of this history, we're dealing with people in some of the lowest classes in society. The archives are sketchy, to say the least. So we have Richard Parsons gathering together a series of witnesses, including churchmen. He's very serious about proving this. He invites them all to watch little Betty get into bed and hear the scratching and knocking. And we have the testimony of the people who witnessed this in this first, what is essentially a séance. And the ghost is asked a question, did you die of natural means? And it knocks, no. Are you the ghost of Fanny Lyons, who lived here 2 years ago? Yes. Were you murdered? Yes, it replies. And this sparks one of the biggest scandals in London because at its heart is the proposition that a respectable, so-called respectable man's reputation can be destroyed by the hearsay, not even of a living woman, but a dead one. And that threatens the whole hierarchy of 18th century society. This patriarchal system of men's power, but also of hierarchy of social class, all of that. And indeed threatens religious belief. It calls into question all the rules by which people live. And very soon, hundreds, if not thousands of people in London are flocking to this small house on Cock Lane to see the ghosts speak for themselves.
And essentially, the haunting of Cock Lane just got out of hand, didn't it? It becomes moderately lucrative for Parsons.
Yes, he charges people at the door.
So, that will have been very appealing to him. But eventually, as you say, it starts to mean too much in too wide a circle. So that other people have a stake in, the Lord Mayor figures that, as you tell us, the Lord Mayor figures that if he proves that the ghost is real, then Kent is a murderer.
Yes.
If he proves the ghost is not real, then he can put it all to bed and Kent is not a murderer. So they treat little Betty appallingly, trying to discover whether she's making it happen.
Yeah, we have to remember that the heart of the story is a 12-year-old girl, and she is really abused and put through the ringer. It's really shocking. So yeah, the scale of the scandal and the question of whether Kent is a murderer, which is debated in all of the daily newspapers in London. He cannot escape this. He wants an answer to this. He wants to clear his own name so he can get on with his life. And the Lord Mayor has to step in because it gets to the point where even the King's brother, the Duke of York, is coming to Cock Lane to see the ghost himself. It draws the wealthiest people. We're not just talking about a few people around Smithfield's grimy streets anymore. And
I mentioned Dr. Johnson. He's one of the...
Well, absolutely.
He gets drafted in on a committee.
He does. So the Lord Mayor sets up a committee. He decides we need, because this is the age of Enlightenment, some learned men to come and sort this out and give us an answer. So Dr. Johnson is put in charge of a committee of medical doctors, religious men. There's one midwife, presumably to tend to Betty because the men can't do that.
Yeah, to check if she's got some device about her.
Absolutely, yes. So she is put to the test, and this committee sit in on the seances, which are happening every night now after a couple of months of this story breaking. They watch as the crowds move through the space, and they hear the knockings, they hear the scratchings, and they hear this being interpreted by the Parsons family as Fanny saying that she was murdered by Kent. And they come up with a sort of a test, I suppose. And this is absolutely this idea of, old superstition and belief in magic and the supernatural versus the new age of scientific rationality. Although Dr. Johnson himself is a very interesting character because he's also very open to the idea of ghosts, actually. So our idea of sort of scientific rationality isn't necessarily the same as that in the 18th century. What they do is they pluck little Betty out of the house in Cock Lane and they take her around London to different houses. And, she is put in beds with strangers. She's made to sleep with the master and mistress of the house, peering in on her at night. At one point, her arms and legs are tied with rope and she's suspended from a ceiling so that everyone can see that she's not making the noises. It's really shocking. And the way that Samuel Johnson decides he's going to settle this because the noises are still happening with Betty. No one can work out what's going on. So he's like, okay, we're going to put that to one side. We're going to go directly to the ghost herself. And instead of waiting to be mediated through Betty, they go to the crypt in St John Clerkenwell, where Fanny was laid to rest 2 years earlier. They take Kent with them, which I think is so remarkable. And I think probably speaks to the fact that he was so desperate to have his name cleared that he was willing to do this. They go down into the crypt, and this is a space, it's a medieval space, with a vaulted ceiling that contained hundreds of coffins. So finding Fanny's from 2 years ago is not very likely. And so we can't say for sure which coffin they do choose as hers, but they open it up. And the newspapers report at the time that she is in there and that she is perfectly, she's as she was at the moment of death. Which
It's not the only time we've had that kind of story.
Exactly.
Exhumed.
Yes.
Especially maidens, especially.
Absolutely. Yes. There's and the fact that she dies when she's heavily pregnant, and it's all a little bit grim. And actually, in the 19th
It's not
century,
really a maiden, come to think.
Well, yes, technically, yes.
Good point. Well made.
But later on in the 19th century, several artists go down and look in her coffin, and she's as you'd expect to find her, let's say. But Samuel Johnson, he heads this committee. They go down into the crypt, they open her coffin up, and they call on her ghost to come and to tell them the truth. And they wait and they wait and they wait. And of course, nothing happens. No ghost comes. And so Samuel Johnson emerges from under the earth, back into the London street, and declares that this has been a hoax, that it's all false. But the interesting thing about this society is that London is so embroiled in this story and so taken with it that not everyone will accept that this is a falsehood. And people still believe the Parsons family. Richard Parsons himself, the father of Betty, is put in the stocks for his role in this and, the damage he's potentially done to Kent's reputation. But when his local community don't come and throw rotten vegetables and dead cats at him, as was the way, in this moment. They bring him water and hold it up to his mouth. They protect him. They believed that he was being haunted and that he was simply telling the truth of what the ghost had to say. So it's a really remarkable story that has such a long legacy and such a complicated legacy. And of course now, you can watch any kind of poltergeist Hollywood film and the knocking, the idea of like once for yes, twice for no, that has permeated our pop culture, and that is from this case.
That's
really.
where it already...
There are a couple of earlier cases that use the same kind of trope, but this is the moment when this idea of a ghost knocking as communication comes into the popular imagination, sticks there. And in the months after the case is supposedly settled, we find the West End of London, the stage is full of different versions of the Cock Lane. We've got sort of funny comic ghosts. We've got satirical jibes being taken at the king, for example, with the ghost, sort of speaking truth to power through the knocking, all of that. We have real kind of horror depictions as well. And yeah, it stays with people for a really long time. And I think it shows the power of a single lie and just how far it can spread. And there are still questions that we have about this story. We don't know. Betty, by the way, is discovered eventually to be knocking on a piece of wood hidden down her dress when she gets into bed. But that seems to be a one-off case because she's been taken to a different house and she's told by the people there, this ghost better come or you're going to be in serious trouble. And so there's, an insinuation that she panics and thinks, gosh, what in this room can I use to knock on? And that maybe she wasn't doing that in the other circumstances. So it's such a tantalising story, and it's one where we have a huge amount of archival evidence, and yet it's difficult to get to the voice of Betty herself as the central liar.
We have to move on because I'm dying to talk about the Yorkshire witch,
yes.
Who was a woman called Mary Bateman. Mm-hmm. Now, we meet her at the beginning of her chapter being hanged.
Yes, as you do.
Which inspires in me sympathy with her. That sympathy drained out in the course of the story. Tell me a little bit, what did Mary Bateman do? How did she come to this rather sad end?
Yeah, so Mary Bateman she sets herself up as a witch. So we have the Cock Lane ghost story in the 1760s, and we meet Mary Bateman, the Yorkshire witch, in the north of England, slightly later in the 1790s, going into the very first years of the 19th century. And this is a moment of industrial explosion in the north of England. Factories are being set up like never before. She comes from a rural village just outside of Thirsk in North Yorkshire. And she finds herself eventually coming to Leeds, as so many people did in this moment, moving from the rural countryside, drawn by the industry, by factory life, by the opportunity of work. And she is a very slippery character. She, interestingly, grew up in the village, seeing the annual fair where travelling families would come sell animals, mostly horses and cattle, but also would tell fortunes. And so she is kind of exposed to this strange, uncanny, magical performance.
And at this point, I've got a lot of sympathy with her because she's looking for a way to make her life mean something more.
Yes.
And, she sees this happening and goes, I can do that.
She kind of fashions herself based on these fortune tellers that she sees as a child and thinks, okay, yeah, there's a way to make money there. And she finds herself in Leeds. She goes through various jobs as a servant. She can't seem to hold a job down. She's got a strange personality. She's very difficult to find in the archive, really, who she was, but she seems to constantly lie and reinvent herself. She's an unreliable person, certainly. But what she finds in Leeds is a new society in which everyone is living a life run by the factory. No more is the kind of rhythm of country life, of seasons, of bringing in the harvest, of drinking to the crop. All of that is gone. And instead you have factory hours. You have people working longer and harder than they've ever worked in their life. You have children in the factories. You have horrific injuries. You just have the constant kind of mechanical grind of this new world going on and people being sort of literally and metaphorically crushed by it. And she looks around her because she is such a canny person. She sees opportunity that she can offer.
I think she's brilliant, actually.
She's a genius,
really.
She's
very, very sophisticated understanding of human nature.
Yeah, she sees that she can offer people a different way of viewing the world, beyond this kind of misery and mundanity. So she sets herself up as a witch, and she offers people things like little spells or magical trinkets that you can sew into your dress that might keep your husband from leaving you. There's a great anecdote I came across of hers where, she comes to a woman in the street and says, your husband's about to run off with his mistress. Did you know this? And the woman's like, oh, God, I didn't know he had a mistress. This is terrible. What's going to happen? I will lose the household income. I will lose his protection. I'll be out on the street. This is awful. And Mary says, well, if you pay me some money, I will put a spell on 2 coals from my fire. You can take the coals round to this woman's house, leave them on the doorstep. She will unwittingly take them into her house, thinking someone's left them for her and how lovely, put them on the fire, and that night, the sparks from the fire will leap onto the dress that she's planning to wear when she runs off with your husband, and she'll have nothing to wear in the morning, so she won't go, and he will stay and be married to you. And of course, this is all nonsense. She's inventing a mistress who doesn't exist. And this is the kind of thing she does again and again and again. And she's just the most extraordinary liar, and you can see how she takes opportunity, but also I think the sympathy for her does run out. She does things like there's a terrible, terrible fire in one of the factories and part of the building collapses and there are huge injuries, children and adults alike, and they're taken to the town hall in Leeds. And there's a call put out in the papers for bandages. We need fresh bandages and linens to tend to these poor people because the factory owners, they don't care. They won't take any responsibility for their employees. So it falls on the community. And so Mary, diligently and heavily pregnant, so, looking quite trustworthy and caring, goes round knocking on doors. Please, can we have some bandages for the poor children who've been burned? Yes, thank you very much. Collects them all up. Does she take them to the town hall? No, she does not. She walks all the way to the other side of the town and sells them on as her own goods. So, she's not someone to be admired. But that is progressively, the least bad thing that she does, and she gets worse and worse. And because she is lying constantly, of course, she's going to be caught out eventually. And the way that she tries to escape being caught is to just layer those lies. And of course, the stakes get higher and higher and higher until eventually she commits a crime that she is hanged for.
Well, yes. Now, she's committed... Well, again, we can't go into all the details. She's committed a couple of murders along the way.
Just a couple of murders.
And then she comes across this couple, the Perigos. Mm-hmm. And when she's performing magic for them, and this is what I really admired, she invents a woman in Scarborough, a Miss Blythe,
she's
to
so
whom
clever
she
to do
has to send and who is going to do the magic and send it back. Mm-hmm. So she sort of creates a distant and shadowy.
Yes, and it feels very modern. It's like
Magician.
scammers today saying, oh, if you give us our money, we will invest it in this company that doesn't exist.
It's exactly the
something
same.
like that. It's basically that. So she, with the Perigos, they are a sort of middle-aged couple living on the edge of Leeds. They were part of a small cottage industry that's been overtaken by the big industry growing up, so they've lost their livelihood. And Rebecca Perigo, the wife, describes a fluttering in her breast. She's not well. There's whether that's a physical illness, a psychological illness, we don't know. But she feels that she is suffering, and they come to Mary as a last resort to help her. And Rebecca's husband deeply loves his wife and will go to any length. And this is what's so tragic and so sort of heinous, I suppose, about Mary's crimes, that she, as you say, repeatedly says, if you give me money, I will send this object. She sort of takes various things off them, anything from a gold coin to some of Rebecca's skirts to bed pans. At one point, they're purchasing a brand new bed for Miss Blythe in Scarborough. But mostly it's, I will post this small object to her. She will say a magical spell over it. It will come back to you via me. And then you will put it under your mattress or in your pillow or sew it into your clothes, and it will protect you. And of course, Rebecca Perigo does not get any better over the years that Mary is in contact with them. She gets worse. And eventually Mary has no option but to silence them because they are becoming suspicious that she might not be the magical heroine that they've wanted. And so she, as a last resort, tells them, right, okay, we've tried everything, and this is a final magical trick we're going to do. I'm going to give you some powder. I mean, with hindsight, not great, but the Perigos buy into it. I'm going to give you some powder. Rebecca, you need to make a pie, and you need to put the powder into the pie and eat all of it. Now, if you start to feel sick, because you might feel sick if you eat this pie, here's a pot of honey. If you also put the powder into the honey, have some of that, and you will feel better if the pie makes you feel sick. And so Rebecca diligently cooks the pie. She and her husband have, I think Rebecca manages 2 or 3 bites, and that's very fateful. And her husband only has 1 before he spits it out. And
because it's disgusting.
It's horrendous. It tastes disgusting. And they are instantly, on their hands and knees, not to be too graphic about it, but, it's not a good scene. There's a lot of vomiting going on. The cat eats some of the vomit at some point. The chickens come into the house and eat it as well. It's horrendous.
And then the cat dies.
The cat dies instantly. The chickens are dead.
Yeah.
Within a few days of suffering, Rebecca is dead as well. And her husband survives just... And he, at this point, he's realised what's going on. And he arranges to meet with Mary on the side of a canal just outside Leeds. And he brings 2 law enforcement officers. They don't have the police force that we do today, but for all intents and purposes, they are, akin to the police. And they're hidden in a bush. And he meets her and he says, you have poisoned us and my wife is dead. And Mary says, no, of course I wouldn't have done that. But, if you give me some money, I'll do a magical spell. She's just, spinning the old stuff. And the policemen jump out from behind the bush. I mean, it's sort of a bit comic, really, and arrest her. And even in that moment, she can't help but lie. She says, this man's trying to sell me magical spells. He's trying to poison me. But she is found to be carrying arsenic on her person. They go to her house and they find there all of the items that the Perigos had been giving to send to Scarborough. They're all there and hidden in her house. And the poor Mr. Perigo, seeing all of this, and the realisation that dawns on him must have been so terrible. The death of his wife is so raw. And we have his testimony because Mary goes to trial in York. She's taken to York and tried at the York Assizes in the Easter. And he stands up and he tells everything. And she is sentenced to death and taken to the gallows. She has one more trick up her sleeve. She tries to plead the belly, the 18th century way of saying, you were pregnant and therefore couldn't be hanged until the baby was born. But the magistrate steps around that by asking volunteer women in the crowd to come forward and inspect her. And, what qualification did they have to say that she was pregnant or not pregnant? They say that she's not, and therefore she's taken to the place of execution. When she is hanged, she's then taken back to Leeds to the infirmary there. And this is a route of, I don't know, I can't remember the distance between York and Leeds, but it would take several hours.
About 25 miles.
There we go, okay. And it would take, a significant amount of time to walk this. And she's taken on the back of a cart, and thousands of people line the route because they want to see her body. They want to check that she's dead because she's so infamous. And when she gets to Leeds, she's put on the anatomist's slab. And she is basically destroyed over the course of 3 days, including her organs being taken out and held up. There's a moment, a sort of really macabre moment where the anatomist, William Hay, cuts out her heart and he holds it up for the audience and someone shouts, "Not black then." And he does cut out her womb and he says there's no baby in it. We don't know if that was necessarily the case. She could have been in the early stages of pregnancy. We don't know. But she is completely destroyed. And William Hay is, a man of science. And he kind of gets frustrated with the people of Yorkshire who, sort of put store by even her body must hold power. And he says, no. He slices her open with a scalpel and says, she's a human like any other. I've cut up hundreds of corpses. She's no different. And yet, at the end of the 3 days, the people who've been watching come up to the anatomist's slab and they touch what's left of her because they are worried that if they don't pay some respect to her, she will come back and haunt the city of Leeds.
She was a terrific witch. I was going to say a good witch, but I think I mean a bad witch.
A powerful witch.
A powerful witch, yes.
Yeah.
I still have a sneaking admiration for her, even though she was a shameless murderer.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting, Tim, that you say that because I've done so many book events where people have come up to me afterwards and said, Mary's my favourite. She's the most interesting. She's
very interesting.
Yeah, and I think she is a monster. I think the other women in the book have complicated lives and find themselves in strange circumstances, and their lives are fascinating. But Mary, there is something monstrous about Mary. You really wouldn't want to encounter her in the flesh.
Well, another Mary Willox. Tell me a little bit about her.
So this Mary is known more famously as Princess Caribou, and this is a story that takes us to the Regency period now. So I think we have a tendency to think of the Regency as, that polite world of Jane Austen. Everyone's going to balls and assemblies, doing dainty little shopping in cities like Bath. That it's all very polite, it's all very clean and pastel-coloured, and, for the sort of the Bridgerton fans amongst you, that's the sort of, the version of that world that we have inherited in our pop culture. Princess Caribou shows us that was not the case for everyone. She's incredible. So in 1817, just outside of the port city of Bristol, which is, a huge international port city in this moment. It's, built its wealth on the slave trade. There are goods and people coming in and out of that city the whole time. And it really is globally connected. Just outside of the city, in a small village, which is still a small village, and the pub that features in this story is still there, and you can go and have a very good pint, I have to say, which I did as part of my very serious research, of course.
Set against tax,
yes, exactly. Yes, my accountant has absolutely done that. So we're in this small village, and into it stumbles and staggers an exhausted and confused young woman, and she is beautiful. She has dark hair.
Yeah, she's universally agreed to have been lovely.
Yes, she is striking, and that's something we find every single person in her history comments on this. She is dainty and elegant. She has some kind of piece of fabric wrapped around her head like a turban, and that's important. And she has slightly outlandish dress. These are the words that are used at the time. And she has quite brown skin and these very dark eyes. And she stumbles into the doorway of a cobbler's cottage and is asking for help in a language that nobody there understands. And she collapses to the floor and nobody knows what to do. So they call the overseer of the poor. Now, overseers of the poor would work in different parishes at this time, and they were essentially there to move on vagrants. And so he scoops her up and takes her in a carriage up the hill to the big house where Magistrate Samuel Worrell lives. And he's a fascinating character. I don't know if any of your listeners watched Poldark, but he's sort of the George Warlegan of this story. He's a real villain. He was known as Samuel the Devil Worrell in Bristol circles. He was a particularly harsh magistrate. He owned a bank. He was, very much a sort of social climber.
So he won't have been amused to have been taken in.
He would not have been amused.
But his wife was the one who was really taken with.
Well, they are presented with this young woman, and neither of them seem to ask that many questions because she's so compelling. She's speaking in a language, again, nobody understands.
Yeah.
The Worrells in their big house have a servant who is Greek. They call him up out of the kitchens and say, do you recognise this language? He doesn't. And so eventually they decide to take her down to the harbour at Bristol, and they sort of parade her up and down, asking various sailors from different ships, do you know what language she's speaking? And crucially, they offer money as a reward if you can identify her language. And therein lies the issue, because they find a Portuguese sailor who just appears in this story for a tiny moment, and he changes the fate of everyone in it. I think he's called Emmanuel, and that's all we find of him. And he talks to this woman, seemingly, in her language, and they have a bit of back and forth, and he's nodding, going, yes, yes. And he turns to Magistrate Worrell and he says, right, yes, she's from the East Indies. I'm not quite sure which island, but one of them. She's a royal, she's a princess, and she is called Caribou. She was kidnapped by pirates, and she's come all the way to Bristol, and she's leapt off the ship and escaped into the countryside. And you would think at this point, certainly from a modern perspective, we're like, of course, this is ridiculous, this is nonsense. But Samuel Worrell, his eyes light up because he's a social climber. He wants people to think highly of him. And here he is presented with a royal woman. This is a princess from a foreign land. Dollar signs come into his eyes, essentially. He thinks, right, great, this is my opportunity. So he accepts this as fact. He brings this woman into his home, and for an entire summer in 1817, he exhibits her for the great and good of Bath and Bristol, the busiest, most fashionable cities in Britain at this moment. And people can come to the house and at Knoll Park, and they can see her bathing in the lake. And she's really objectified and eroticized. She's given very skimpy outfits just to get in the water. She's invited to have fencing matches with the gentlemen who visit. She has sort of strange rituals where she goes onto the roof of the house to pray. She drinks tea, but she'll never drink it from the same cup. And she has this whole sort of routine of washing, and she has to cover her eyes when she drinks, and all of this stuff, which seems incredibly outlandish. And
but it's exotic.
It's exotic.
People love doing things for the exotic.
Absolutely. And in this moment, the sort of broader context is the British Empire, which had focused so long on the American colonies and the Caribbean, of course, and all of its wealth coming from slavery there. The American War of Independence, Revolution, depending on your perspective, happens in the 1770s. And then there's a huge shift of focus away to the east, to India and the East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. And there is a mania for quote-unquote exotic things from this part of the world. There is, fashionable wallpaper. Women have bits of clothing and jewellery that echoes the kind of designs that you might find there. In the same year or within a few months that this Princess Caribou is discovered, Sir Stamford Raffles, who is the ex-governor of Java, one of the Indonesian islands, comes back to Britain and writes like a great tome, The History of Java, and it's about the sort of the strange and marvelous behaviours of its indigenous people and its plants and volcanoes and all of that. So this is the height of fashion, and so people are flocking to come and see this princess. And for several weeks, she is the talk of the town. She appears in every newspaper. And the Worrells even invite a very fashionable doctor from Bath to come and interrogate her, I suppose, loosely, but essentially to make his name, to make them and her famous. And this is a doctor called Dr. Wilkinson. And this is such an interesting story to me because the question of who is the liar here starts to become a difficult one to answer. So Dr. Wilkinson is supposedly one of the inspirations for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. He's a galvanist. He is involved in the early years of the 19th century in London in electrocuting a man who is hanged for murdering his wife and child. And when he electrocutes this corpse, the man supposedly sits up on the bench, his eyes, come wide open and his legs shudder. And he now spends his time making money in Bath, electrocuting not corpses, but frogs for, sort of fashionable people who've come to bathe in the baths there and come for sort of, health and social reasons. So he's essentially a showman. He's a bit of a scientist, but he's mostly a showman. And the summer when this is all taking place, by the way, Mary Shelley is just a few meters down from his rooms finishing the novel of Frankenstein. So this is, the sort of the
It's in the air then.
It's in the air. We think of Bath in this moment as Jane Austen's city, but this is Mary Shelley's city. This is the Gothic flip side of that coin. And Dr. Wilkinson, his speciality, and I think he's so gross, his speciality is the treatment of women. And he loves to electrocute the ladies. If you've just given birth, if you have mastitis, if you're a bit depressed, if you have a cough, he will come to your house and electrocute you. Not to be tried at home, folks. And he is invited to meet Caribou. And he, a little bit like Samuel Worrell, the magistrate, his eyes open wide and he thinks, this is my chance to really make my name. I'm going to become famous. And he sits with her every day in the library at Knoll Park and writes down, or gets her to write down, again, it's a little bit woolly, the language that she's speaking. Now, we have that language. I have seen it in the archives. It is, to a modern eye, and it's the end papers of the book, in fact, so people who purchase this can see it for themselves. It is a mismatch of, there are Hebrew letters in there's some Arabic, there's some ancient Greek. It's basically stolen. There's some Chinese symbols. It's stolen from reference books in no library, essentially.
And that's probably not Mary. Her background, we'll hint at it in due course, it does not suggest that she would have been able to pull those things together. So
I think that is not.
Wilkinson.
It's Wilkinson. And the crucial thing, I think, is when you go to the archive, you can see Wilkinson's letters in his own hand, in his own ink, and you can see Mary's supposed writing of her language. They're the same. He also gets her to draw a map of the route that she took with the pirates from the island that she claims is called Javasu. Again, does Wilkinson introduce this? We know Java is a real place. This is sort of a playful twist on that sounds plausible to an 18th century British ear. But the route that she takes from fictional Javasu to Britain, and it's a big squiggly line, and then in Wilkinson's hand, and it is Wilkinson's hand, we can see he's labelled all the fictional and real places along the way. And he claims that, this is the account that he's given her. And he goes so far as to send samples of her writing to Sir Stamford Raffles, who was the governor of Java, whose book has just come out, to academics at Oxford. And he even petitions the East India Company to pay him to do an expedition to the East Indies to go and find the island of Java.
He's bought into that, even though he must know.
I think he's so convinced
contributing to the fabrication.
He's going to become famous, whatever. And I think that's all he wants. He's so hungry to be.
Well, we're still talking about him.
Absolutely. And I think, what was his plan if he'd done the expedition and got out there and not found Javasu? What would he have done then? But he never gets the opportunity to do that because, of course, she is found out. And Princess Caribou is, in fact, not a princess from the East Indies. She's a cobbler's daughter from Devon.
Yeah, but the thing about Caribou is, it's a bit like the Shroud of Turin. It's more interesting as a fake than it would have been if it was true, if it was authentic.
Absolutely. That is what's so fascinating. And when we actually find who Caribou is, she's a woman called Mary Wilcox. Her story is so deeply troubling and interesting, both now to a modern audience, but also to the people in the early 19th century who had consumed her story. And she shows, she holds a mirror up to this Regency society and shows just how far people can fall, how desperate things can become, and how the ruling classes, the magistrates, the doctors, the scientists, these people who are benefiting from the explosion of so-called Enlightenment, are willing to buy into a fantasy rather than see the reality for themselves. And when they are faced with the true story of Mary's life and how she came to be Princess Caribou, they are shocked and they also are ruined. Samuel Worrell, the magistrate, his bank becomes bankrupt, and completely falls apart. Dr. Wilkinson, his career goes down the toilet. He doesn't publish anything for something like 20 years after this happens. They're all humiliated. And Mary herself is left with this version of a princess that's been ripped apart, but that she kind of clings to. I mean, she's sent to America after she's been discovered as a fake.
So sort of just to get rid of her.
Just to get rid of her. I mean, the Worrells literally put her on a boat with a couple of nuns and send her to Philadelphia. And she takes Caribou onto the stage because it's the only option available to her.
It's all she's got. Yeah.
It's all she's got. And she tours the East Coast of America and she becomes so famous there. The Americans love this idea of the English being duped and that the Americans are so much more canny, so they understand it's false and the English were so stupid they were taken in by it. She draws such crowds and she's such good entertainment that in the same year, in 1817, going into 1818, James Monroe, the new president, does a tour of the East Coast and she draws bigger crowds than him. And sometimes he turns up and they're all down the road to see Princess Caribou and not the new president. So, she has this strange legacy, but the truth of her life leading up to that point is truly extraordinary.
It must have been very lonely being Princess Caribou, pretending you couldn't speak English.
I think so, and I always wonder, at what point did Mary realise what was happening? We know that eventually she does make her way back to Britain many years later in, I think, 1824, 25, and she lives, just such a tragic life again. She does manage to marry, and interestingly, the man that she marries, his surname is Baker. And Baker is a name that she uses as one of her false identities earlier on in her life, which I think is a coincidence, but I think it's a sort of strange full circle moment that she becomes one of these characters. She is Mrs. Baker, who she's claimed to be previously.
And I think I can take some comfort to the fact that she lived to the age of 73. She's not.
Yeah.
She did not have a truncated, horrible end that some of these women might have.
Yeah, absolutely. She does live a life, and she goes on to have a daughter. We know she possibly has other children who die in infancy. Again, not unusual for the age, but there's a lot in the book about how some of those children are buried in the garden because they can't afford to pay for a proper funeral, and later on they're discovered when a drain is being put in. Her husband's accused of putting them in the ground, and there is grimness to come in her life. We do know that she's still famous. She lives in Bristol for the rest of her life in a real poverty. I mean, she ends her life as a leech seller, so someone who would get up early in the morning, go out into the marshes and rivers around Bristol with her skirts tucked in and her legs bare, and the leeches would attach themselves to her skin, and she would peel them off, put them in a basket, and sell them to the hospitals.
It wouldn't be your first choice of profession, would it?
It's not something I would like to do, but leeches were used in huge numbers in the 19th century and in medical care. So, there was a steady income to be made, but not a huge one. But, it kept her, I suppose, with a roof over her head. And she collapses in the street in her 70s on Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, I think, in a suburb of Bristol. And I sort of see it as this sort of last dramatic act. She's such a spectacle her whole life, whether she means to or not. And she goes out in that way as well. But yeah, I think she was the most moving of the hoaxers in my book. And whether she's even worthy of the moniker of hoaxer, I don't know. I think it's difficult to say how much she herself was aware of the lie, how much she propagated it, or how much it was projected onto her.
Well, it makes for a lively narrative and an extremely entertaining book. So thank you very much. That is Dr. Madeleine Pelling, Hoax, Truth and Lies in the Age of Enlightenment. It's published by Profile at £22. Maddie, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tim.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.